Hello, everybody. This is John Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we are here with the second of our 5-Minute Histories videos about historic sites connected with the Revolutionary War. And I'm here in Fells Point. Most of us don't connect Fells Point with the Revolutionary War. Maybe we connect it with lively nightlife or a great place to eat lunch and watch the sugar ships filling up Domino sugar across the harbor. But in fact, Fells Point played a critical role in the Revolutionary War in turning out ships for the U.S. Navy. And we're going to talk about one ship and one gentleman in particular. The ship is called the Hornet, and the gentleman is named Joshua Barney. The U.S. Navy was formed in 1775 as tensions were mounting with the colonies and Great Britain. Young Joshua Barney, who was born here in Baltimore, was one of the first naval heroes. The U.S. Navy, Maryland did not have a good start with the U.S. Navy. When the debate was raging in the Continental Congress on whether to form a Navy, our own delegate, Thomas Stone, called it the maddest idea that he'd ever heard. And in fact, he was staunchly against it, but none other than John Adams was the chief proponent, and the U.S. Navy did get launched. There were a few ships built at first, but most of the U.S. Navy were ships that were merchant ships and then retrofitted with things like cannons and new sails to become ships of war. And Baltimore turned out dozens of those ships contributing to the U.S. Navy. The Hornet was one of them. And Barney, who was born here in 1759, joined the Navy at its sort of first conception in 1776. And he was put on board the ship, the Hornet, and he was made the first mate. He'd been at sea since age 12, so he kind of knew what he was doing. So he was made the first mate, and here in Baltimore, the Hornet was being fitted out, turning from a merchant ship to a ship of war, along with a companion ship called the Wasp. And Barney's job as first mate, in addition to cannons, the ship needed a crew. And so Barney was charged with recruiting a crew. And the way he did that was he had gotten a flag, an early U.S. flag from Philadelphia, and he flew it on top of the ship. And then he wandered up and down Thames Street, accosting more or less every young man that he could find and said, "Hey, you see that flag? That's a U.S. Navy ship. Don't you want to enlist and help the cause, beat those dastardly British, and go on to fame and fortune and adventure on the seas?" And apparently he was successful. Both the Hornet and the Wasp got their crews. They met up with the U.S. Navy squadron outside of Philadelphia and then sailed for what would be the first U.S. naval encounter in the war, and of course, the first U.S. naval encounter in history. The U.S. Navy, with the Hornet and the Wasp included, sailed down to the Bahamas, to Nassau, and successfully took over an ammunition depot and got much needed gunpowder. So that was Barney's start in the U.S. Navy. He went on to join the Wasp. I guess he liked his Baltimore ships, defending the Delaware River, and then he, over his career in the U.S. and the Revolutionary War, he was captured and then basically traded for freedom. The U.S. and the British would trade prisoners, so he was captured and then traded for freedom several times. But eventually, he was captured and then put in prison in Plymouth, and this is not Plymouth, Massachusetts. This is Plymouth, England, in a real jail. But miraculously, he and two of his fellow crew prisoners managed to find disguises, and they slipped past the guards at the jail. And then they went down to the shore and they found a ship of British fishermen, a small little boat that was about to take off, and they more or less ousted the British fishermen and took the boat and sailed it across the British Channel and sailed it back to France, and then they eventually made it back home, where Barney, of course, goes right back to the Navy, signs in, and he gets made in charge of a ship called the Andrew Doria, which is again put in charge of defending the Delaware Bay, which he does successfully and bravely, becomes promoted to a lieutenant. The final chapter of Barney's in the Revolution was he was put in charge of a ship called the Monk, and he was told to sail to Paris, to France, with letters for Benjamin Franklin, who was over there furiously trying to negotiate peace. So Barney slips through the blockades, makes it to France, finds Benjamin Franklin, and on his return home, he carries the message that Franklin had been successful and that peace had been negotiated. We had won the Revolutionary War. So our own Barney gets to bring home the good news. Barney, after the Revolution, is a seaman for life. He joins the French Navy, and then in the War of 1812 comes back and is put in charge of defending the Chesapeake with the U.S. Navy in the War of 1812. Famously, outside of St. Leonard, he evades an overwhelming number of British ships, retreats up a creek where the British ships couldn't get him. Then, with the help of some land reinforcements, sails through the blockade and escapes with the bulk of his ships. However, the British were hopping mad at that, and in revenge, they burned the town of St. Leonard. So it was good for Barney, but maybe not so good for the folks at St. Leonard. Final thing is Barney's final act, sort of a bravery, is that in the War of 1812, he also is a Marine with the Marines who are defending Washington from the British at the Battle of Bladensburg. In fact, he's one of 350 Marines that James Madison is personally giving commands to. He takes a bullet in the leg, and in 1818 later dies from that wound. So final thing that I want to say in wrapping up is Barney, before the War of 1812, and we covered this a little bit before when we talked about Federal Hill. When Maryland ratifies the U.S. Constitution, I think we were the sixth or seventh state to do so, we held an enormous party and a parade. And at the head of the parade was none other than Joshua Barney, the Revolutionary War hero. And he leads this parade in a small replica ship called the Federalist. And they parade this little ship on a cart through town, and then they go up to Federal Hill and they have a big party. Then they roll it down the hill, and lo and behold, it floats. They sail it around what they call the basin, which we call the inner harbor. And then he eventually gets in it, a few days later, gets in it and sails it to Annapolis, and then eventually to Mount Vernon, where he presents it to President Washington as a gift. So Barney and his start here in the Revolutionary War at an early date with ships fitted out from merchant ships to ships of war, none other than here on our streets of Fells Point. So as we're celebrating the 4th of July, come down here, take a look at Domino Sugar, of course, but also think of our role in contributing towards our independence. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.